anything else.
Thank you so much. I think
The subcommittee will come to order. Members present will be permitted to submit written statements to be included in the official record of the hearing. Without objection, the hearing record will remain open for 5 calendar days to allow statements, questions, and extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. This afternoon, we continue our hearing on human rights in South Asia. In the morning, we heard from the top State Department officials on that issue, the Assistant Secretary for South Asia and the Assistant Secretary for Human Rights. We will now hear from our private panel. As I mentioned this morning, Kashmir is hardly the only human rights issue in South Asia, but it's the one that's in the news and attracting attention around the country. So we have 4 witnesses who will focus on Kashmir and India. We reached out to the Kashmiri community of this country. We got a list from the West Coast group that was then certified as a wonderful list by the East Coast group. And lo and behold, and it had a mixture of people. Some were Kashmiri Muslims and some were not. The ones who were Kashmiri Muslims did not want to testify, or at least didn't respond to our request. So although we do not have any Muslim born in the Kashmir Valley testifying, we do have testifying people who have been suggested by the leaders of that community. We will also have a witness discussing Pakistan and Sindh. This hearing and this panel is not exclusively focusing on Kashmir or India. So I will introduce the first witness, and we'll hear from that witness, and then we'll go on to the next witness. The first I'll introduce is R.T. Tiko Singh, who is the senior assistant editor at the Times of India. She has covered Kashmir extensively and has reported from other conflict zones in India. She is an alumnus of Columbia University School of International Affairs. After the forced displacement of her community, I believe the Pandit community, from the Kashmir Valley in 1990. She grew up in Jammu. And of course, the hundreds of thousands of Hindus, often referred to as Pandits, did leave the Kashmir Valley in the very early 1990s. And that is part of the historical context of what is happening today. So let us hear from Ms. Singh.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. One of the most important tenets of human rights is, and I quote, "Wherever men and women are persecuted because of their race, religion, or political views, that place must, at that moment, become the center of the universe." That was Elie Wiesel in the context of the Jewish Holocaust, when the world, for the longest time, remained silent and chose to ignore the cries of Jews in the Nazi Germany. The discernment that this committee has shown towards human rights in South Asia, therefore, is commendable. I would like to express my gratitude to Subcommittee Chairman Brad Sherman and Ranking Member Ted Yoho for inviting me to appear as a witness in this august House today. Since, as a journalist, I have worked mostly in Indian state of Jammu and Kashmir, I will speak for its people and leave it to my co-panelists to speak about the grave human rights violations committed in other countries of South Asia, especially Pakistani provinces of Balochistan and Sindh. Although I'm myself one of the persecuted Kashmiris who grew up in destitution as a refugee in my own country, I do not represent my community here today. I am here as a conscientious journalist who believes that the role of a journalist is to be a watchdog of society and to be a voice of the voiceless and powerless. So I will speak here nothing but the complete truth. I have to say that most of what you read in the Western press and some sections of Indian press is a distorted reality of Kashmir. While they're rightly highlighting the instances of violations committed by the Indian security forces, the story is often presented without context and a historical understanding, but it also carries a lot of certitude and self-righteousness of a narrative that helps the perpetrator and not the victim of human rights abuse in Kashmir. So let me tell you who the victim and the perpetrator of human rights abuse in Kashmir is. The victim is my friend, my Kashmiri Muslim friend, Shujat Bukhari. Who was Shujat Bukhari? Shujat was a senior journalist and a peace activist who believed in resolving Kashmir through dialogue between India and Pakistan. Shujat went from one capital city to another in the world, trying to convince powerful players that Kashmir needs peace. Several years ago, Shujat and I met here in the United States, and we spent a whole day discussing how we could put an end to the violence that Kashmir had seen and where both Hindus and Muslims had been destroyed. I heard him say that he wanted to see his children growing up in a plural and progressive Kashmir, that Kashmir used to be while we were growing up. We parted ways on a hopeful note that one day Kashmir will be peaceful and we will live together as we used to in a syncretic culture once upon a time. We met several times in Delhi in the last few years debating and discussing Kashmir as we had resolved to. The last time we spoke on phone, he complained that I hadn't seen him whenever I visited Kashmir during every crisis. I promised that I will visit him next time. Shujat did not keep his part of the promise. On June 14, 2018, he was shot dead right outside of his office in Presclave area of Srinagar. Who shot dead Shujat Bukhari? Lashkar-e-Taiba, the same terror group that has been banned by the US, the same terror group that perpetrated Mumbai terror attacks. Why did they kill him? Because Shujat wanted Pakistan to end the violence and human rights abuse in Kashmir. They killed him because he wanted peace. Who is the victim in Kashmir? The victim is 65-year-old Ghulam Mohiddin Mir of Srinagar, who as a businessman would pay all his profits, zakat, charity, year after year to the poor in Kashmir. But just weeks ago, on August 29th, he was shot dead. By whom? By Pakistan-sponsored terrorists. Why? Because he had dared to open his shop, defying the orders of Jaish-e-Mohammed, the same terror group responsible for the kidnapping and beheading of Wall Street Journal reporter Daniel Pearl in 2002. Jaish, in the last 2 months, has been issuing posters warning Kashmiri Muslims not to resume their normal life. The victim is that 5-year-old girl, Asma Jan, who along with her father...
Excuse me, you know, opening statements are supposed to be 5 minutes. If you would wrap up.
I would really request you to give me just 2 more minutes.
I'm sorry, we have a very long panel here.
I'll
Every one of them has 20 minutes of information they want to impart.
I'll try to wrap it up. The fundamental point that I'm trying to make is the victims in Kashmir are the ones who have been killed and massacred by Pakistani-sponsored terrorists. The number of Kashmiri Muslims who have been killed in Kashmir is immense, and they have been victimized by Pakistani terror state. I just want to make the last point. But throughout these 30 years of conflict, throughout these 30 years of Islamic jihad and terror in Kashmir perpetrated by Pakistan has been completely ignored and overlooked by the world press. There is no human rights activist and no press in the world which feels that it is their moral obligation to talk or write about the victims of Pakistani terror in Kashmir. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now the ranking member has a matter of personal privilege. He would like to give an opening statement at the beginning of the second panel, and I'm sure we'll learn much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be real brief. We're going to build on this meeting from this morning's meeting, and it was so important. And Ms. Singh, I appreciate you bringing up the topic you did, because who else is the victim? The other victims are the ones that haven't been born yet. It's the future generations. We see a backsliding in democracies. Everybody in this room that believes in the democratic form of government, whether it's a republic like ours or whatever is in India or some other country, that's what's at risk here. And the human rights abuses, they're all around the world. They're in our country too. And to have a civil society that grows and builds from one day to the next for the future generations, you have to have rule of law. You have to have respect of life. You have to have acknowledgement and tolerance of differences. And that's something we collectively have to do. And if we don't do that, we're going to backslide. And we're going to backslide away from Western democracies, and God knows into what else. We can look in the Bible. We can look in the Quran. You can look back to where we came from. And I don't want to go back there, because as you pointed out, and I've talked to people over and over again from around the world, do you have the same beliefs that I do, that you want a better life for your children, a better life for security and things like that? Universally, everybody says yes. The only form of government that I know that protects that and guarantees that is a democracy of some sorts. And they're messy. Ben Franklin warned us of that. They are messy. But by God, they're worth it, because it gives opportunity to the people. And we have to hold our governments accountable. And if I'm not doing the job, I tell people, fire me. It's okay. You can unelect me. And I think that's something we need to take to the bank. But you only can do that in a country that has rule of law and will honor that. And so it's the future generations that we are, the people in government, and anybody that's listening to this or here in government, it is our responsibility to hold ourselves accountable and those around us to preserve that which gives opportunity to those next generations, so that we can get rid of all this conflict and all this garbage that we've been meddled with for the last thousands of years, so that we can focus on where we're going as a civilization. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate it. I have to leave. I'm going to leave my very capable staff here to take notes and bring me up to speed. Thank you.
Thank you. And having opened the door at the beginning of the hearing, I recognize people for 1-minute opening statements, but Mr. Bera has made an appearance now for the second panel. He's a member of our subcommittee and the full committee, and he's recognized for a liberal 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Sherman. You know, it's been a busy morning. My apologies about not being at the first hearing. We're tending to our own democracy here in America. But, you know, someone who has been a strong champion of the relationship between the United States and India and the United States and South Asia, the strength of India is its basis as a secular democracy, and, you know, its history as a secular democracy. And, you know, as the world's largest democracy, you know, the core foundational basis of a democracy is the protection of minority rights. And I understand democracy is complicated. Again, we're managing our own democracy here. But a message, and Kashmir and Jammu are equally complicated. You know, these are internal issues that we certainly want resolved. But I would, you know, make an urgent plea to India to certainly allow journalists back in to have accurate reporting, to see what's going on the ground. You know, I certainly, as members of Congress and others, you know, travel to the region. Again, we want to be of assistance. And, you know, at the end of the day, the core values of democracy, of human rights, of civil rights, and, you know, are core foundational aspects that we cherish as the world's oldest democracy, and certainly we believe India cherishes as the world's largest democracy. So, you know, the sooner we can get back to normalization of communication and you know, press and others being able to visit, you know, I think it's in India's interest to do that, and certainly in the world's interest as the two most prominent democracies in the world. So with that, I'll yield back.
Yes, I don't see a request from the gentleman from Illinois. And so we will go on to our next witness, Natasha Kroll is an associate professor at the University of Westminster. She's associated with the Center for the Study of Democracy. Her research and publications covered themes relating to democracy, political economy, identity, and feminist and post-colonial critiques. And we will now hear from Ms. Kroll.
Yeah,
Or should I say Dr. Kroll?
Yeah, Kaul, actually. Thank you so much. Let me just start the timer because I have to fill this house in on, apologies, fill this house in on 1,000 years in 5 minutes. But let me begin by saying good afternoon to everyone here, Chair Sherman and everyone else. I want to begin by saying that I'm mindful of the ironies of speaking here in non-communal terms, being someone who's a Kashmiri Pandit herself by birth, but also being someone who's from Kashmir, grew up in India, lives in England, and is speaking in the US today. So there are multiple colonial transitions there that are important. And I think that because my written statement is already with you, I will focus on some of those points. But let me just respond to a few things by starting out by saying that the parallels with Nazi Germany and with the Holocaust are actually very apt, because the RSS in India, and about whom concerns were raised in the morning as well, is a nationwide paramilitary that is the ideological parent of the current ruling party. And the RSS has avowedly an idea of turning India into a Hindu nation. It also has this idea of an undivided India where everything else in the region will become a part of a Hindu India. Please also remember that the New York Times in 1922 had profiled Hitler, saying that Mr. Hitler's anti-Semitism is neither as violent nor as genuine as it sounds. So things take time to unfold, and the proto-fascist trajectory that sadly the secular democracy of India is on is very worrying for us all. Let me also say that Shujat Bukhari, I have been to Kashmir every year, 2015, 16, 17, 18, 19, including this year during the elections when the whole place was deserted. And Shujat Bukhari, on that visit at the end of 2016, was the person who had launched my novel. I also write fiction in Kashmir. There is a video of that on YouTube. And he had spoken about the value and worth of what I'm saying. So I do not represent here Indian interests or Pakistani interests. And in fact, that is precisely the problem, that the people who speak about Kashmiri self-interest and the rights of Kashmiris themselves are the ones who are most vulnerable from any and every side. The communal politics serves no one. It does not serve the Indians. And Kashmir, if Kashmir were a communal issue, then Muslims in India would feel the same as Kashmiri Muslims, and they do not. So it is not a communal issue. It is, albeit, an issue that has been communalized. I also want to say that every other day for Kashmiris is a commemoration of a massacre. And when Indians, and this is really not personally against Indians or Pakistanis, but when Indians expect an acknowledgement of a massacre like the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, where under General Dyer, fire was opened on unarmed protesters. What about all of the Kashmiri protesters? What we are asking here is really very, very simple. We're asking for human rights, for substantive democracy, and for the question of freedom, that people who have been fired upon for just gathering non-violently over the years in numerous massacres that I have listed in my statement, there should be an acknowledgement from the state to say, we are sorry. Nothing can move on until there is an acknowledgement of all of the human rights violations that have gone on for these people who have been an important site of early Buddhism, who have seen Hindu rulers, who have seen Mughal rulers, Afghan rulers, and then who have been sold for the equivalent of something like $150,000 in 1846 by clauses of the Treaty of Lahore and Amritsar without their consent, and who have then had an unrepresentative ruler who's, throughout the 19th century, it's a story of absolute tragedy. And when we come into the 20th century, I mean, Kashmir is one of the first interstate disputes that the UN was prominently involved in. And there are several resolutions in those early years that the UN was actually trying under various people to demilitarize, under Norton, under Dixon, under Menzies. This is a long and complex history, but that complexity should not blind us to should not obfuscate from us the very simple fact that there is a political problem here, which is compounded by human rights violations, and the international community has a role, because this has not just implications for Kashmiris who are currently under siege and under collective punishment, being deprived of their very basic rights, but it also has regional and potentially global implications, because people travel across borders, and ideas, when they are suffocated, and dissent, when it is suffocated, becomes the hardest to handle. So I want to say, I also want to look at the time, because can someone just tell me how many minutes, seconds do I have? I do have time. Okay, I do want to. I want to take my 5 minutes for sure. The question here is really not so much about Article 370. The fundamental question here is about the consent of the people. If something is being carried out, if something is being carried out for people's welfare, for their development, then why does it need tens of thousands of troops being brought in? Why does it have to happen overnight without absolutely any consultation of the people, with placing even the pro-India politicians in prison and then depriving the population of the right to say anything? If it is for their good, then why won't anyone of them be allowed to say something about it? This is an egregious human rights violation. It goes against consent, goes against fundamental principles of dissent as they relate to democracy. And as people who are being claimed in the name of a democracy as rights-bearing individuals, this is something that they fundamentally should be allowed to do. This is arbitrary use of power with no accountability.
Thank you. Our next witness is Angana Chatterji, who is the co-chair of Political Conflict, Gender and People's Rights Initiative at the Center for Race and Gender at the University of California in Berkeley. A cultural anthropologist, she focuses on issues of political conflict, gender, power and violence, majoritarian nationalism, and related issues. She is also a distinguished author, and if I had time, I would read the names of all of her books. She's now recognized for a liberal 5 minutes.
Thank you so much. I'm honored to have this opportunity to address this distinguished panel. The 2014 and 2019 elections have led to the repositioning of India as a majoritarian state. Hindu majoritarianism sanctifies India as intrinsically Hindu and marks the non-Hindu as its adversary. What is going on in Kashmir needs to be read within that landscape. Race and nation are being made synonymous, and Hindus, the formerly colonized, now governing elite, are depicted as the national race. The siege of August 5 signaled the dissolution of the right of Kashmiris to consent over their present and their future. In October 2019, India's incumbent Home Minister, Mr. Amit Shah, reportedly stated that Western human rights standards cannot be blindly applied to India. And I would here ask us to also recognize and remember that Mr. Modi and Mr. Shah were also part of the government in Gujarat in 2002 when the pogrom against the Muslim community took place, and they have never actually apologized or claimed responsibility. In Kashmir, through the protracted conflict, atrocities have been committed against the civilian population that include dispossession, displacement, enforced disappearances, rape, torture, extrajudicial execution, and their burial in unknown and mass graves that I have investigated. I have actually walked through the graveyards that hold Kashmir's dead, and I have met with grieving families. I've listened to a testimony of a mother who sleepwalks to the grave of her son, attempting to resuscitate his body. I have met with half-widows, women whose husbands have been disappeared. Kashmir's population lives with recurrent trauma and social death, and with a very high rate of suicidal behaviors. Only on the rarest of occasions does a female victim of gendered or sexualized violence succeed in even bringing her case through the judicial system. Torture, too, is an intrinsic component of governance in Kashmir. If I want to spend a minute talking about Kashmiri resistance and human rights. If the stand of the ruling party in India is that the resolution of the Kashmir issue will be attempted through demographic changes made possible through the abrogation of Article 35A and the nullification of Article 370, many in Kashmir fear the intent of this demographic change may be culturally and potentially physically genocidal. The international community must engage in protecting the rights of Kashmiris and amplifying their voices. Subjected to a near constant state of suppression for decades as Kashmiris have been, and in active and continual dissent as Kashmiris have been, how can the Indian state take for granted the collective consent of the Kashmiri people? Kashmiri state that following August 5, 2019, they are afraid of their forcible incorporation into the Union of India by Hindu nationalists. Many are apprehensive that inhuman conditions, extreme brutality, and the negation of human rights by institutions of state could foster an armed uprising within Kashmir yet again. Human rights violations and the states of exception that sustain them cannot be addressed without demilitarization. Demilitarization of Kashmir is repeatedly discoursed as an issue between India and Pakistan. Further, the fraught relations of historical animosity between the two states continue to cast a long shadow over Kashmir. Kashmiris across every diversity and difference stipulate that they must be recognized as legitimate and the principal stakeholders in any and all matters pertaining to Kashmir's future, and that their right to determine and govern their destiny must be recognized. Thank you. I will end with just one quotation from someone who's been living in the Kashmir Valley. It's two people, it's a composite. She says, "We are under siege. Isolation is a cage in which we live. There is fear of escalation of violence, state violence, insurgent violence. The atmosphere is one of unchecked reprisal, and it has resulted in the silencing of the people. We feel our future is very uncertain. My words are silent. In this silence, I can hear the screams. I see the streaks of blood on the steps of the shop. I smell the anguish. I hear the state's violent denials, the eyes of a boy blinded by pellets last week. I see my sister's tears as the soldier grabs her. Our rage, the soldier's sadistic gaze, the bullets lodged in the wall next to our home. I see." Thank you.
Thank you so much for that presentation. Before I introduce the next witness, I'll point out that in addition to the witnesses officially notified, I've got someone who will make a 2-minute statement at the end of the other witnesses and will join us at the witness table for that statement. But we are going now to go on to Ravi Batra, who is chair of the National Advisory Council for South Asian Affairs and a strong supporter of the U.S.-India relationship.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Brad Sherman, Ranker Yoho, members of the Foreign Affairs Committee, and particularly to the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, the distinguished gentleman from New York, Eliot Engel. Before I start, permit me to acknowledge my respect for the principled and deliberative leadership of Chairman Engel of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and thank him for the invitation to testify today, and you, Mr. Chairman Sherman, in accommodating yet another speaker. Let me also thank and acknowledge Chairman Engel and Speaker Pelosi, who went on a grueling trip to Afghanistan to know the actual facts and interact with the leaders of Afghanistan. Finally, permit me a brief relevant sentence about myself. I'm a New Yorker, having left India when I was 7 years old, and on 9/11, I tasted the dust of World Trade Center. Since then, I see serving the best interests of these United States in first eradicating terror, as there are no rights and no law if terror reigns. I'm bold enough to assert that ought to be America's primary foreign policy goal, a terror-free world. The world is changing, and so is terror. It used to be that an insult could trigger a lone wolf terrorist. After the demented massacre of peaceful worshipers in Christchurch in New Zealand, a billionaire's adult children blew themselves up on Easter Sunday earlier this year, thereby trying to make it a holy war, a war we must not permit to even get started. Terror is bad enough. We need not drag religion into it. Pope Francis is exactly right. We need to treat all faiths with respect. The central issue this subcommittee has to address is, quote, how soon can we eradicate terror globally so human rights can flourish everywhere? Close quotes. This begs the question of sequencing. For as we put on our socks before our shoes, we must first eradicate terror and protect public safety so law and order may govern society, and any violation of rights, be they constitutional, statutory, contractual, or human rights, the courts can fashion a just remedy one case at a time. America is and must remain a force for good, and our precious freedoms, which we all take for granted, the very nectar of American exceptionalism, born of our cherished separated powers regime, is why good folks around the world love us. But freedoms require, as we well know thanks to Abraham Lincoln, sometimes even a civil war, with suspension of habeas corpus, to first keep the nation united, restore public safety, and only then can a government of, by, and for the people govern justly. The United States has two co-equal political branches, a fact often not well comprehended by nations around the world. Take, for example, Senator Chris Van Hollen's recent visit to India. Yet to them, we, the United States, the executive and the Congress, have to make clear that we are a friend of South Asia in general, the subcontinent in particular. This especially includes Pakistan, who has been our loyal ally during the Cold War, while India was seeking to be non-aligned and yet close to then USSR. Fortunately, after decades of trying to get India to be America's best friend, a work in progress, under the decisive leadership of Prime Minister Modi, we recently saw in the House Foreign Affairs ranker McCall's home state, Texas, the Howdy Modi event, where protocol and precedents were discarded and a foreign head of government introduced an American president on American soil. Such was and is the love affair between the United States and India. Indeed, when my wife Ranju and I interacted with Prime Minister Modi during the UNGA last month, I told him, quote, if he was alive 500 years ago, Columbus would have been looking for Modi, not just India, end quote. And then a few days ago, there was an informal summit between China's President Xi and Prime Minister Modi in India, where a 100-year plan was discussed for the dragon and the elephant to live and work together. This bothers me, even as I wish everyone to have peaceful neighbors. I'm very protective, perhaps to belong better to our founding fathers, of India's role in the birth of the American Revolution, as Indian tea bopped in the Boston Harbor in 1773. India is why Columbus discovered the Americas in 1492, and hence India can claim to be America's birth mother. The Indian Constitution was drafted by a Columbia Law graduate, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, who liberally took our Constitution and Supreme Court precedents and wrote India's Constitution. It is this singular fact that we can root our relationship in. And with Modi's promise of indivisibility that he made in the joint address to Congress, let freedom ring all over South Asia. Indeed, 1.2 billion Indians think of the American freedoms as their own, and the American dream as their own. Pakistan's celebrity Prime Minister Imran Khan is a man I respect and have much hope in, for he knows what a rules-based order is, given his superstar status of a cricketer. He knows that terrorists have taken residence in his country and are a threat to our service members as well as to his neighbors in Afghanistan and India. That nations can use terror as a part of statecraft ought not be permitted. I'd argue even more, counterbalance is a failed pillar of statecraft and ought be abandoned. Mr. Chairman, if you'd permit me a little liberal 5 minutes. With respect to Afghanistan, it is clear to me for some time that we must maintain our military base in Afghanistan permanently. Even before I visited Tajikistan in May 2019, where I had a candid discussion with its foreign minister, Sirajuddin Muhyiddin, and then spoke at the high-level joint conference on counterterrorism convened by that country and United Nations Office of Counterterrorism. We have remained in Germany and Japan for 70 years. If we are to contain terror successfully in South Asia and nipping in the bud, we should stay in Afghanistan and not allow another attack in New York. Kashmir, watching Brexit is torture. The partition of 1947 was much worse. And Lord Mountbatten and his erstwhile Major Brown played fast, loose, and dirty. I wrote an op-ed that was published in various papers entitled, quote, Kashmir, Heaven on Earth, only if you remember Louisiana and Alaska, end quote. To save time, I incorporate it here and by reference and attach it here too in my statement. A simple point worth making, Kashmir was attached to India by a legal decree signed by its then Hindu ruler, Maharaja Hari Singh, several months after the needlessly bloody partition when tens of millions were killed. Like our acquisition of Louisiana from Napoleon and Alaska from the Tsar of Russia. No then resident of Louisiana or Alaska could force us, the United States, to hold an election so the residents could become an independent state. Their choice was to love us or leave us. Same applied to India in 1947 and to date. What has transpired, to be kind, is nothing short of malpractice of relevant leaders well recorded in history.
I think you've made your point. Thank you. And I'll point out, Kashmir has been controversial since Maharaja Gulab Singh purchased the Kashmir Valley from the British. And as you point out, we purchased Louisiana and Alaska. We are all for human rights. We are all opposed to terrorism. We're all for self-determination and territorial integrity, and we look forward to applying those principles. We now go to witnesses that are focused on the rest of South Asia, at least in part. And the first of these is Fatima Kaul. I've worked with her for so many years, along with her husband, Sufi Lagari, as they focus on human rights in Sindh. And I got a chance to meet her brother-in-law, who was then killed by forces yet unproven. And so we look forward to hearing about Pakistan and especially Sindh from Ms. Kaul.
Thank you, Chairman Sherman, Chairman Engel, and members of the committee. Before I begin, let me thank you for inviting me to this important hearing on human rights in South Asia. Mr. Chairman, on September 15, 2019, religious extremists attacked schools, temples, houses, and businesses of Sindhi Hindus in Ghotki, a town in Sindh province of Pakistan. The attackers left chaos and terror across neighborhoods. These attacks were carried out on the pretext that a Sindhi Hindu professor, Notan Lal, had committed blasphemy. Despite lack of evidence, Lal was taken into police custody. These attacks, which lasted for over a week, were completely blacked out by Pakistani media. Since 1990, 70 people have been killed for blasphemy, and 40 people are currently serving life sentences and on death row. Mr. Chairman, religious persecution remains a silent feature of Pakistan. Hindus, Christians, Ahmadis, Shias, Zikri Baloch Muslims, and Hazaras are helpless victims at the hands of religious extremists who operate with government impunity. Mr. Chairman, Pakistan is the only country in the world which legislated against its own citizens. Mr. Chairman, based on eyewitnesses, Pakistani military supports terrorists who have carried out massacres of Hazaras. Today, the Hazara population hardly reaches 5 million, mostly concentrated in Quetta, Balochistan. For the last 4 years, Hazaras have been terrified to do even small, simple tasks like going to their jobs and sending their kids to school. Mr. Chairman, when comparing violence against women in countries, Pakistan ranks 6th most dangerous country for women in regards to violence and rape. According to Human Rights Watch, child sexual abuse remains disturbingly common in Pakistan, 141 cases reported just in Lahore, Punjab, in the first half of 2018. According to the police reports, but none of the suspects had been convicted till today. I will also add, Mr. Chairman, that at least 77 girls and 79 boys were raped, according to the police reports. But none of the suspects had been arrested yet. According to the same report, 1,000 young Sindhi Hindu girls and 700 Christian girls have been abducted to convert them to Islam. Mr. Chairman, according to Sahil, an Islamabad-based organization, 3,832 cases of child abuse were reported in 2018. 33% rise seen in child sexual abuse cases. Mr. Chairman, the Pakistani government also commits a different kind of child abuse, mere criminal negligence. More than 800 Sindhi kids face a potential death after being infected with HIV. In July 2019, 10 members of US Congress wrote a letter to President Trump to raise this issue with Imran Khan. Since that letter, 25 more innocent Sindhi children have died with HIV. With the amount US aid Pakistan consistently receives for its public health sector, I'm only talking about public health sector, this HIV crisis should not have occurred at all. Mr. Chairman, in September 2019, Masood Shah, a Sindhi nationalist and only eyewitness in Irshad Ranjhani murder case, enforcedly disappeared just days before his court hearing. When Mr. Shah's brothers and friends went on to protest for his recovery, they themselves were abducted in the middle of the night. We are talking about total 11 people, including 4 brothers of Masood Shah. Eventually, they were produced before a court in Karachi. Now they are falsely accused of treason. Their defense lawyer said it is unprecedented when persons are charged on sedition for merely raising slogans and implying signs. Mr. Chairman, here are just some of the recommendations I want to mention here. Pakistan should pass a legislation that criminalizes forced conversions of these young girls. Majority of them are minor. Pakistan should allow journalists and full access to Balochistan, Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, and Sindh. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I'll point out that many times we have governments who say, well, they can't control the human rights in this area or that area or as a non-state actor. But when a country's legal system criminalizes blasphemy, it's an invitation to anyone who doesn't like a member of a minority religion to claim that person blasphemed. And when they impose the death penalty for blasphemy, even when that's on the books, it's an invitation to the most terrible human rights abuses. With that, we have our final regular witness, Francisco Bencosme, the Asia-Pacific Advocacy Manager for Amnesty International. He will look at all of the human rights issues across South Asia in the 5 minutes allotted. And before joining Amnesty, he was a professional staff member in the second most prestigious House of the United States Congress. You're recognized.
Chairman Sherman, and distinguished members of the House, thank you for holding this timely hearing on this crucial subject and for that introduction. Amnesty International is a global human rights organization with human rights activists all around the world, where we look to shine a light on abuses in some of the darkest places. Prior to this hearing, I submitted a written statement which looks comprehensively at human rights violations being conducted in 5 countries, including India, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and Nepal. I'd also like to insert into the congressional record a statement by Human Rights Watch. For the oral statement, I'd like to focus on two trends we're seeing in the region: a growing crackdown on freedom of expression and a mounting wave of anti-Muslim sentiment that is plaguing the region. Almost 1 year ago today, the government of India raided the office of Amnesty India for 10 hours. They ordered some of our staff to not leave, lock the gates, and not use their mobile phones. Since the raids, our funds have been frozen, forcing Amnesty India to grind its work to a halt and to downsize its staff. This is also not unique to Amnesty. Weeks before, it was Greenpeace and The Quint, a news website. In July of this year, authorities filed a criminal case against Lawyers Collective, a group that provides legal aid, advocates for the rights of marginalized groups, and campaigns to end discrimination against LGBTQ people. It's also not unique to India as well, where we've seen Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and Nepal all create draft NGO legislation to crack down on civil society. We're one of the largest human rights organizations in the country of India, doing crucial work such as research on Kashmir, where we've been documenting abuses for over a decade. And according to reporters, the Indian government is actually planning further action against both Amnesty and Greenpeace that could happen any day now, and imminent arrests are expected of our top staff. As the world's largest democracy and as a crucial strategic partner to the United States, what does this say about India when they crack down on human rights organizations and civil society organizations? I'm here today representing Amnesty International to ask if Congress and this administration could please speak up and loudly on behalf of human rights activists and civil society organizations who are doing on-the-ground research to uncover these human rights abuses. On Kashmir, last week, we came out with one of the most comprehensive updates on the human rights situation in Kashmir, where we documented a clear pattern of arbitrary detention on politicians and activists, cases of security forces abuses, such as torture and inhumane treatment, and a communication clampdown, which undermined the ability for individuals to reach health services in the region. Second, I would like to highlight the increasing growing trend of anti-Muslim xenophobic backlash in the region. In Bangladesh, the fallout of a Rohingya repatriation deal in August created a flurry of xenophobic and hate messages spreading against the Rohingya refugees on social media. This backlash has the possibility of turning the host community against them, which would endanger the Rohingya's future in Bangladesh and a return to Myanmar. Earlier this year, a large number of Rohingya refugees organized a rally of appreciation for Bangladesh and appeals to Myanmar to speak to them about safe returns. But this had amounted to further restrictions on their freedom of peaceful assembly, expression, and movement. The Bangladesh authorities have shut down mobile phone networks inside the refugee camps and made announcements about erecting barbed wire fences around the camps. The influx of more than 700,000 Rohingya refugees since August 2017 has resulted in a huge population of affected communities. About 500,000 Rohingya are school-aged children who have no access to accredited education and are at risk of becoming a lost generation and are vulnerable to forced recruitment into armed groups, child labor, sexual exploitation, and child marriage. In Assam, more than 1.9 million people have been left out from the final list of the National Register of Citizens. Many of them have been Muslims. Amnesty International expresses deep concerns about the functioning of the 100 or more Foreigners Tribunal, which will decide whether these excluded from the NRC list are Indian citizens or not. Amnesty International has strongly urged the Assam government to ensure that the Foreigners Tribunal function with utmost transparency and are in line with fair trial standards guaranteed under international law. In a recent television interview, a senior Indian official said that there will be a nationwide National Register of Citizens before 2024. The extension of NRC risks the mirroring of discrimination and arbitrary deprivation of nationality, as observed in Assam, to the rest of India, which stands to result in wide-scale statelessness. In Sri Lanka, in the wave of the 2019 Easter Sunday massacre at a church, violent mobs unleashed their rage against Sri Lankan Muslims and refugees. from Muslim-majority countries. The attacks followed similar violence in 2018, 2017, and 2014, when armed mobs attacked and torched Muslim-owned homes, businesses, and places of worship. These mobs included hardline Buddhist monks who took part in the attacks and incited violence against Muslims. These are only a few of the many instances that we have documented in the region. Overall, the situation in South Asia is dire, deteriorating, and require the international community, especially the United States, to pay its utmost attention. Thank you.
I'll now ask Dr. Asif Mahmood to step forward as a somewhat informal witness and recognize him for a conservative 2 minutes. I will point out that he was a candidate for insurance commissioner in my state of California, received more votes than any Muslim American in our history, and has been a strong advocate for Muslim Americans in the United States. Dr. Mahmood.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Sherman, for your courage, wisdom, and leadership. And thank you.
If you want to keep talking like that, I'll recognize you for 10 or 20 minutes. Go on.
Again, thank you, Chairman Sherman, for your courage, wisdom, and leadership. And thank you, each and every member of this committee, from the bottom of my heart. And also, on the behalf of 8+ million Kashmiris who have been sieged for over 12 weeks now. I don't know any of those Kashmiris personally, but I feel strongly bonded to them, just like my immediate family. That is why I am here today. I have a message for them. You are not alone. We are watching, and we will stand with you firmly and strongly until each and every one of you get your basic human rights secured and verifiable. We have few people here with some concerns, and many in this country that on this hearing today, we don't have a single Muslim. Friends, we are facing a very tyrannic regime. We are facing brutal administrations who can go on, who can harass, who can hurt you, who can kidnap you, who can kill you. Many of people have families in India and Kashmir. Many have businesses who are worried about losing their visa or getting their visa canceled. Many have their future and business linked to that. You must have understood by now what I mean. But we picked two witnesses who are very courageous, and they will speak truth as you heard them earlier. I'm a practicing physician, and I sit on Medical Board of California, the largest medical board in this country. I am compelled to talk about medical, physical, and mental health in this kind of circumstances. As a healthcare provider, I know when patients miss their appointments or their prescriptions, what can be devastating and dangerous effects be. And we have witnessed and we have seen the consequences in Kashmir, not just simple consequences, but deaths now. Children are not getting the vaccination, which is not only dangerous for them or their families, but for the society. Mental health issues are exponentially rising. Anxiety, panic, depression, suicidal thoughts and homicidal thoughts, and worst of them, post-traumatic stress disorder, which can last rest of their life with them. When you take parents away from the children, or when you take children from 11 to 15-year-old away 1,000 miles, that is going to make a scar on their brains. I hope this committee can listen to those concerns, and I hope this committee can come to solid resolutions which can make difference and give a light and future to those people who are under siege. And at a last note, I want to say it can be only Trump who can say welcome to Modi, who was just banned from coming to the United States a few years ago. Thank you for your time.
Yes. I do want to correct the record in one respect, and that is we do have a Muslim American witness. She focused on Pakistan rather than Kashmir. You, of course, have focused on Kashmir. And two other witnesses, regardless of their religion, were strongly suggested by both East Coast and West Coast Kashmiris. With that, I will recognize for 5 minutes the gentlelady from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, sir, and thank you to the panelists. My name is Chrissy Houlahan. I represent a community just outside of Philadelphia. I want to thank the chairman for holding this very important hearing today. And many of my constituents within my community have shared stories with me and my staff about being caught in the crisis in Kashmir, and I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to ask questions and to investigate on their behalves. So my first question has to do with the U.S.-India relationship and is directed to, I'm sorry if I mispronounce it, Dr. Chatterji. Is that correct? We obviously value our relationship with India. We have shared and common values, ostensibly. And that being said, I think that the personal testimonies from my constituents and the media reports coming out of the region demonstrate that there is something that is going on in Kashmir that doesn't reflect the common values that we hold. And so with that in mind, could you talk about gender issues, gender rights in that region, and how does the status of women in Kashmir compared to other parts of India and Pakistan, if you're able? And if it's okay, maybe we'll do about, I don't know, 35 seconds to a minute on that, because I have so many things to ask.
Certainly. I am an anthropologist, and we're sort of encumbered by language and other issues, so I'm not in a position to speak on field realities in Pakistan. Theoretically, yes, but I will speak to Kashmir. I think that in Kashmiri society, from what I have found, there's a tremendous sense of according of equity and equality in relation to women. Women are powerful in Kashmir. Women take to the streets as much as men do. Women are fierce. It is actually women, often disproportionately, it is men that have been targeted in Kashmir, that have been disappeared or killed in extrajudicial executions, or those that are buried in the unknown and mass graves. It is women that become heads of households, that then have to also not only care for their families, but seek justice. And is it at the same time the larger patriarchal context of South Asia? Does it apply to Kashmir? It applies to every part of South Asia, patriarchal as well as heteronormative. But within that, is that what you were asking? I was a little confused. Or were you asking about sexual violence?
It's more about the gender rights of women in Kashmir.
Oh, okay. So then to say that there have been incalculable gendered and sexualized violences that have been perpetrated on women. I know young women who did not want to go to school. They love learning. They don't want to go to school because at the entrance of the school, there's a checkpoint, there's a soldier, they may be frisked, and they get exhausted by that because it's violent, it's abusive. The ways in which the relation between the Indian forces or the relation of the Indian forces to Kashmiri women is extremely dangerous. There's a sense that the body of the woman is where one can sort of, it becomes the battlefield. And especially the Hinduization also of the forces that we've been witnessing over the past, I would say, 15 years since Ayodhya, the Hinduization of the forces. So there's an added element to it. I think in India, Islamophobia today has quite escalated. Women, it's very, very difficult for them to perform daily tasks. There has been no studies undertaken on rapes, for example. The rapes that we have witnessed in Konanpushpura from 1991, justice is still pending. We saw a terrifying case of a rape and murder of an 8-year-old girl last year. I will stop. I'm way over.
No, I appreciate it, and I believe you have something to contribute.
Yes, yes, I'm actually dying to say something. So we recently, me and Atharzia, another Kashmiri, we compiled the first ever volume on women in Kashmir, entirely written by Kashmiri women scholars themselves. And the realities of it are astoundingly worrying. You know, there's the Konanpushpura mass rapes. There's various instances of sexual violence, the competing patriarchies of of militarization and militancy that women have to face. But Kashmir is not backward when it comes to women's rights. In fact, compared to India, it has always been more progressive. In 1944, the New Kashmir Manifesto, this is important for the world to know. In 1944, the New Kashmir Manifesto actually specifically had a whole section on gender rights, which if you read today sounds progressive, and is. So Kashmiri women have always had their rights. In fact, much of what has been going on, this is a very colonial move on the part of the nation states around it, of claiming as if they are liberating Kashmiri women, as if they are mere territory. And in the aftermath of the revocation of Article 370, BJP leaders said, we are going to now marry fair Kashmiri
my time
women.
has expired,
So
and
it's like
perhaps
they're-
if I have the opportunity to have more time, I will go back to my second question, which was for you, indeed, Ms. Singh.
I'm really sorry.
Thank you. We'll be recognizing first those members of the subcommittee who are here, then those members of the full committee who are here, and then members of Congress who are not a member of either the sub or the full committee. With that in mind, recognize the gentleman from Michigan.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for holding this crucial hearing. And I just want to start by thanking you all so much for your work, for your scholarship, for your work on the ground, the different roles you play. I don't even really know where to start. I've spoken out about what happened in Kashmir and caught a lot of heck for it, but I don't really care. It's really important that we speak the truth about these matters. And I just came back from Bangladesh, where I'm very concerned about the survival of democracy after the very difficult or problematic elections of December 30th, and the conditions of workers in the ready-made garment factories and elsewhere, which are very tenuous. But let me, just given the short amount of time, let me focus on a couple of these matters. Mr. Bencosme, I want to ask you about your organization's view of the situation sort of in a going forward way in Kashmir. The government of India is very eager to meet with me and all of us and tell us their view of things. But even so, people who use pay-as-you-go cell phones don't have service restored. The internet's not restored. They're still not letting foreign journalists in. And how do you see the situation going forward with just the most basic elements of life, people's health situation and so forth, based on Amnesty's work there?
Yeah, thank you so much, Congressman. As I mentioned, we just came out with a report, which is one of the most comprehensive and up-to-date report on the situation on the ground. And unfortunately, the situation is very dire. You mentioned issues of medical services. People that we spoke to and interviewed on the ground said that because of the communications blockade, there's been a 50% drop in patients due to no public transportation for people to be able to reach hospitals. Critical medicines for advanced stages of many diseases are not available. There isn't a post or courier services really impacting the healthcare services inside Kashmir. I think it'll be looking forward. I think it'll be really incumbent upon the international community, this body, the administration, to really press upon the Indian government that this is not okay, that irrespective of security concerns, there needs to be a better balance between human rights and security, and there actually needs to be real, there needs to be a release of any political prisoners who are in Kashmir. There needs to be, the communications blockade needs to be lifted, and that this, situation needs to stop. And frankly, I saw this morning's testimony and thought that there's still a lot more the administration could be voicing with respect to Kashmir, and it oftentimes holds back punches because of the importance that India plays.
Let me just carry forward on that. As somebody who traveled to, I don't know if I should admit this, how old I am, but to Kashmir and Ladakh over 30 years ago when I was a graduate student in Asian languages and cultures at the great University of Michigan, it's hard for me to take seriously the argument that this is being done for the economic development of Kashmir and to unleash the... Can you or others speak to this argument? Is now tourism blossoming and so forth? I mean, this is what we're being told, right?
Yeah, it's completely unthinkable to think that you need to, in order to increase tourism, you would block all communication inside the region. The idea that you would arbitrarily detain political leaders, activists, and even children, that, as we've reported, in order to for economic development purposes.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
Let me just ask you quickly about the situation in Assam. And I have to say that as an American, it's so much more difficult to go around the world and to talk to people from around the world where the rights of people to citizenship in their own country and the rights of refugees are at stake when we are denying the most basic human rights of people trying to approach our own country as refugees. But this body, anyway, is fighting for basic human rights at our own borders. And with that spirit in mind, what on earth can we say about the situation in Assam? These are people who have lived there for many, many years. How likely is it for someone to be able to produce papers about their child, birth certificates and all these documents that are being demanded of people from many decades ago? And what's the way forward here?
Yeah, so one of our main calls in Assam is for transparency of the foreign tribunal system, which is one of the recourses that people who have been left off the list could take. We unfortunately believe those tribunals do not meet international standards. And frankly, you know, this morning was the first time I've seen the State Department speak to the issue of Assam. Now, clearly, they could be raising these issues privately, but it really holds to the importance of Congress raising these issues, the fact that it's really forcing this administration's feet to the fire and really speaking up on these issues.
Well, thank you. My time's expired, but we need to talk about human rights in public, and our administration needs to start doing that. Thank you all so much.
Well, I do want to advise, we've allowed people to clap. That's really not what we should be doing here. And I'll ask the observers to simply observe. I've reserved, speaking of reserving, I have not yet asked my questions, but we're going to go to the gentlelady from Pennsylvania, member of the full committee, Susan Wild.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I too have a substantial population of people in my district in Pennsylvania who are very much concerned about this situation. I have a sizable Indian population and a sizable Pakistani population, Muslims, and all of the at least four of the religions of India are represented in my district, and I have spoken with people who have advanced arguments on both sides of this issue. So quite honestly, my interest is in finding the truth because it's such an emotionally charged issue, and frankly, people I respect on both sides are telling me different things. So it's very, very hard for somebody on the outside like we are to understand this issue and really get to the bottom of it. And so along those lines, and I'm going to address this to Mr. Bencosme, is that correct? It's been very difficult for somebody like me to monitor the situation in Kashmir as it evolves because of the crackdown on journalists and humanitarian aid workers and political leaders. I know that U.S. Senator Chris Van Hollen and a delegation of Indian opposition members were denied entry amidst what I understand to have been a blackout on communications from within the state. And historically, humanitarian aid workers and journalists and political leaders have been able to conduct their work even in active war zones. So I guess my first question is, what is the justification for this lack of transparency around these actions? Help me understand that.
We don't think there's a legitimate justification for the lack of transparency. If one of our calls is for there to be an independent investigation, a commission of inquiry, if you will, whether it could be created by the United Nations or by another international body, one that can really get at the bottom of what is going on. We ourselves have conducted our own research on the ground. We hold ourselves to the highest evidentiary basis and operate all around the world, and have found, as I mentioned, arbitrary detention of not just political leaders, but regular people in Kashmir, people who are plumbers or food distributors, and even cases of children being detained for, according to the Indian government, vague notions of security or economic development.
So this question seems to have sparked a lot of interest on the panel, so I'm going to stay with the question and ask Mr. Batra, what did you want to contribute to this?
Thank you very much. I just want to highlight one point to this panel and this committee, and thank you, first of all, for holding this hearing, Chairman Sherman. This panel is to figure out what American foreign policy should be, and we're here, and I'm here, as an American citizen looking through an American lens. I don't want to import the violence and the unhappiness that exists in the neighborhood that exists in the subcontinent. Here, Americans of Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi, Sri Lankan, they live happily next to each other. I want to make sure that continues.
I'm going to ask you just to
So to
answer
your
my
point-
question, because I want to get to another.
So to your point that you raised, when you have people afraid to come out of their house because they don't know if they're going to be blown up, because cross-border terrorism exists as a daily event, and homegrown terror is being nurtured, the first thing somebody wants, before they want human rights, they want to live.
I've
Once you
heard
live-
that rationale, but it still doesn't explain the lack of transparency to me. Ms. Kaul, could you address that?
Yes, absolutely. There's no justification whatsoever for what they're doing, and they know that, which is why it is important for them not to let people speak. In fact, elderly women in Srinagar who were protesting in Kashmir Valley were detained, arrested, released on the condition that they sign bonds saying that they won't speak to the media. This is just 2 days ago. So it is fundamentally not about violent actors. It is about knowing that what is being carried out is politically and constitutionally not right, and it doesn't have the support of people. Secondly,
I'm sorry, let me stop you before my time runs out, because I just want to say as an observation here, and I wish we had more time for all of you to weigh in, that to me, when there isn't transparency, something is being hidden. And this is what really concerns me terribly. And as I said, I'm on the outside, but to not be able to actually have accountability is very troubling to me. Ms. Singh, I'm already over time, and
I'll just take a few seconds. In 2016, I was there as a journalist on the ground. We have had almost 80 youth killed in clashes with security forces. It is about right to life more than anything else. If this Congress does not understand that the right of life supersedes every other right, every other fundamental right, I don't know what to say. Thank you.
You need to have a Codell go back to India and see Kashmir for yourself. And that will be a great lens.
May I add something in?
Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. I'll now recognize myself for 5 minutes. As I said in the first panel, the greatest deprivation of human rights is that Dr. Afridi is still in jail. Here's a man who played a critical role in us getting Osama bin Laden. I've gone so, frankly, Pakistan should honor and release Dr. Afridi, but I have even suggested an exchange for Dr. Siddiqui, which is the only time I've advocated the release of a convicted terrorist before that terrorist has served their term. The Pandits left the Kashmir Valley, as I understand it, in roughly 1990. Ms. Singh, how many left? Where are they now? Do they plan on moving back?
Well, it's a difficult question, Chairman Sherman, simply because the security situation in Kashmir has not changed, and I don't anticipate it changing anytime soon, simply because Pakistan has continued with its Islamic jihad and Islamic cross-border terror even in the last 2-3 months. There has been infiltration. There are reports, intelligence reports about terror attacks. In Feb this year, we have had a major Pulwama suicide bombing in which 44 soldiers were killed in one day. So therefore, unless Kashmiri Pandits or any minority group in Kashmir feels that they are secure in that environment, I don't know if they can return. My other point that I really wanted to make is to my co-panelists. She said that it is not about communal, Kashmir is not really about communalism. The truth is
I'm sorry, you answered my question. I've got to go on with another question.
just little point, just one little point.
I have limited time, Uncle. The Indian government has justified the repeal of Section 370, et cetera, Article 370, as somehow a major step forward for women's rights. But they've then told me that this then relates to what if a Muslim Kashmiri woman married a non-Muslim man? I don't know how, and then property rights. Ms. Kaul, is Article 3, is the repeal of that somehow a step forward for women's rights?
It's absolutely not, although it is claimed that it is somehow going to enhance LGBTQ rights and women's rights, as if those people whose rights it would enhance are not Kashmiris as well. Moreover, on both of these cases, in the case of the LGBTQ rights as well as in women's rights, there are already prior judgments of the courts. I've got this here, that the Jammu and Kashmir High Court in October 2002, in a case on State and Others versus Dr. Sushila Sahani, struck down the proviso of the fact that the state subject with permanent residency law, according to which women marrying outsiders would lose their permanent status. So this was already removed in 2002, and it is a red herring to say that this is somehow going to help women's rights. Like with all of the other things, these are just instruments used to justify that, that emancipation and liberation narrative.
I want to go on, and that is to focus on the Union territory. Perhaps the gentleman from Amnesty International could focus on this. It's one thing to take away Kashmir's unique status, where it had more autonomy than other states of India. But now, as I understand it, the Kashmir Valley at least will be a Union territory where it will have less status. I know I'll ask the gentleman from Amnesty International first, and then we may have time for others to respond to this. And if you haven't focused on this, I'll go on to one of the other witnesses.
Yeah, we don't focus on territorial issues, so maybe.
Okay. Ms. Chatterji.
Yes. If the Union territory, it is actually demarcated, Jammu and Kashmir, into Union territory, you're absolutely right. It will have less status than it does now. Two things I wanted to point out. One is the idea was for security and for development. However, Article 35A, which allows Kashmiris to determine who are residents and who can own land, that proviso is now gone. That proviso being gone, meaning Kashmiris may not be landowners in Kashmir. So their claim to the land itself might be vitiated, might be nullified over time.
You're saying that somehow this change in an article deals with land ownership in the Kashmir Valley. We'll try to get a clarification on that. I would point out that one of the purposes of 370 was to maintain the demographics of Kashmir.
That's right.
That makes sense, perhaps, if you regard Kashmir as an autonomous territory.
That's right.
In the time I've lived in California, the demographics have changed. The state has not had the right to prevent that change, and thank God it hasn't, because the state has gotten better and more diverse. So whether the national government or a subnational government determines immigration to an area depends in large part as to whether the subnational is virtually autonomous. I have so many people raising their hands. I'll ask Ms. Gould if she has a comment on this.
Congressman, as a Sindhi American, my concern is our country and our foreign policy. And we have to be very aware when we are discussing these issues. We have to be very aware that, you know, we have to identify the Pakistani element. We have to identify, you know, there are so many other issues. How many Kashmirs exist in Pakistan? No one talks about it, just because, you know, they want to play this, you know, in a way.
My
to
time
weaken
has
India.
more than expired, and I now recognize the gentlelady from Minnesota.
Thank you, Chairman. This is a really important discussion, and I'm glad we're having it. Ms. Singh, as a reporter's job is to find the objective truth about what's happening and report it to the public. You have an enormous audience at the Times of India, and you have an enormous responsibility to get it right. I'm aware of how the narrative shaped by reporting can distort the truth. I'm also very aware of how it could be limited to sharing only the official side of the story. The press at its worst when it is a mouthpiece for a government. In your version of the story, the only problems in Kashmir are caused by what you call militants. The only people protesting to break away from India and are all nefariously backed by Pakistan. You also make the incredible dubious claim that the Indian government's crackdown in Kashmir is good for human rights. If it was good for human rights, Ms. Singh, it wouldn't be happening in secret. You make what I might call a feminist case for the occupation of Kashmir and the communication shutdowns, saying it would be better for women. Dr. Chatterji, as the co-chair of the Initiative of Conflict, Gender, and People's Rights at the University of California, Berkeley, I would say you might be an expert on this particular issue. Do you agree with Ms. Singh's assertion that what's happening in Kashmir since August has been good for women's rights?
No, absolutely not. As you said yourself, if it were good for anybody, we would announce it. It would be announced to the world. It would be free. We would be able to go there, right? We would be able to enjoy it. And most importantly, the people that it's being done to would be appreciative. We have not had Kashmiris in Kashmir be appreciative. They have said they felt like they were being caged. They have said that their rights were being revoked. They're terrified because when we talk about human rights, in this instance with the BJP government, we also need to understand their ideology. Yeah. Because there is an ideological platform and assertion through which and because of which human rights are being violated. And if we simply focus on the human rights and try to ameliorate what is actually not working, it will not work. Because their mandate, for the first time in India openly, is to render India into a Hindu state.
Right. Thank you. Mr. Bencosme, you are the advocate manager for covering Asia for Amnesty International. I'm sure you do condemn terrorism as I do. Do you agree with me that you can do both at the same time, that you can think about the problem of Pakistan supporting terrorism and the human rights violations in Pakistan in a way negates our ability to hold India responsible for the behavior in Kashmir?
Absolutely.
And how so?
Every nation has the right to care about its territorial integrity and security issues in their own country. But I think it's dubious the claim that you need to shut down all forms of communication in order to have security in the Kashmir region. It's dubious the idea that you have to lock up political leaders, activists, children. You don't need to harass journalists in order to be able to have security in a region. And instead, you can find a balance between the two.
Yeah, and Dr. Kaul, you have the distinction of being both a scholar of democracy and feminism, as well as being the first Kashmiri woman ever to have a novel published in English. Would you weigh in on this particular issue of feminism and women's rights?
Yes, I want to speak as a politics and IR person with that hat on. So I just want to say that you're absolutely right. This, when we express concern about enforced disappearances in other parts of the world, that is precisely why we should care. Parveena Ahangar, who's the chairperson of the Association of Parents of Disappeared People, whose son was a victim of that, and she's been leading that struggle for 20 plus years. On International Day of Disappeared this year, they were not even allowed to gather and mourn, something that they've done on the 10th of every month and at the end of August. So this is an elderly woman, who has led this campaign, who's been nominated for the Nobel Prize. People, activists, peaceful people even, are not allowed that space. So everyone is being pushed towards this, this kind of, and as Angana pointed out, I do want to say that the Hindutva ideology, the political use of Hinduism, religion is neither a necessary nor a sufficient condition for violence. No religion is. So this is not about Hinduism, it's about the political use of Hinduism that is being made to convert India into a Hindu nation, where after the revocation of Article 370, BJP leaders have said, we want to go to Kashmir and marry fair women now. And that's literally, like, that's the level at which this whole thing is, that it's this exotic other. And the reason that all of this continues, the question of territorial integrity, it's really not simple. It's, yeah, the British did what they did, but we're in the world now. And as the statement says outside your archives, the past is a prologue. The future is the story that we have to write right now. It's not a simple question of territorial integrity, because Article 370 had, according to which Kashmir had its own constitution, its own flag, and its control over defense, except for defense, telecommunication, and external affairs, Kashmir was autonomous. That autonomy has been literally taken away, overnight, and that was the article that was keeping that political dispute in some sort of a frozen zone. Now that's gone, and what we are fearing is the worst to come.
All right, I am a minute over past my time.
People unfamiliar with Congress should recognize that the time is allocated to a member. It is up to them to decide how to allocate that among the witnesses. I'm responsible for my 5, okay, it took 6 minutes, and each member of Congress asking questions will decide. If we really left it up to the witnesses, we'd be here past midnight. And with that, we go on to the gentleman from California, Mr. Lieu.
Thank you, Congressman Sherman, for calling this hearing. I start off by noting that Secretary of State Pompeo has made protecting religious freedom one of the main priorities of his tenure. So I'd like to talk about religious freedom in India. There are 2 articles I'd like to first submit for the record. The first is in Newsweek, dated September 24th, 2019. Pastor Franklin Graham is quoted as saying Christian persecution in India is very troubling. Second article I want to submit for the record is from the Christian Post. It is dated September 27, 2019. The title is Over 1,000 Incidents of Christian Persecution in India Reported Since 2014, 219 in 2019. This coincides with when the Modi government took power. So my first question to Mr. Bencosme, it is correct, isn't it, that the current government in India is persecuting Christians?
We've documented cases where there's been violence against Christian minorities. Not all of them are state-sponsored.
And would you say the current government has intentions of essentially having India be one religion?
As a human rights organization that focuses on sort of high level of evidence, we can't speak to a government's motivation. What we have been able to document, like you mentioned, is a substantial increase of religious and sort of hate-based violence against religious minorities and other minorities.
And in fact, it's not just Christians, it's actually any religion that's not Hindu, isn't that correct?
Correct.
In fact, they've been going after Muslims as well, isn't that right?
Correct.
All right, so I want to submit another article for the record. It is dated October 9th, 2019. The title of it is India's Christians and Muslims Face Higher Persecution Since Modi Government, and that is in the National Catholic Reporter. So let's now turn to an area that's predominantly Muslim, Kashmir. And we had this communications blackout of Kashmir. That is a human rights violation. And either Ms. Kaul or Ms. Chatterji, it had to be the case, isn't it correct, that multiple people would have died? Because if you have a heart attack or a stroke or something else and you need an ambulance and there are no communications, you can't get that ambulance, isn't that right?
That is correct. Absolutely.
Okay. So it is just on its face unbelievable when the Indian government says no one died in Kashmir due to communications blackout. That would be correct, wouldn't it?
We have no way of knowing. You know, there was one doctor who was publicly speaking out against this, and in front of cameras, he was whisked away because he was warning about the shortage of medicines and the fact that people who are suffering from life-threatening illnesses are dying.
I want to add that when the state itself, its officials are seen as perpetrators, and we turn to the same officials to provide justice, becomes very problematic. And this is one of the reasons that Kashmiris repeatedly want this matter, their matter, to be internationalized. This is one of the reasons that we need international attention and scrutiny, because...
Right. So let me add on to that. In addition to communications blackout, they were actually using force against some of the Kashmiris, including pellet guns.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes.
All right, so I'd like to submit another article for the record. It's from CNN, dated August 28, 2019. It says, under the curtain, Kashmir residents contend with pellet guns and restrictions. I simply want to read a few sentences from it. On August 10th, Farouk Ahmed Qureshi walked out of his home to buy some bread from his local bakery. He found himself in the middle of a demonstration. He started moving towards a baker's shop, and then he heard a sound, and next blood started oozing from his left eye. I fell down and started crying in pain. The doctor told him he had been hit in the eye by pellets. The doctors who treated me said I have little chance of regaining my sight as 3 pellets had seriously damaged my eye. The article goes on and says that essentially in August 5th alone, there have been 30 cases reported to this hospital of eye injuries. And essentially, the India government is blinding Kashmiris, right, with these pellet guns.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes,
go ahead.
May I add something else to this? Also, we've talked a lot about terrorism and infiltration today, and by the government's own admission, I've put together records from 2006 to 2019, what the state's own record has said about active militants in Jammu and Kashmir. And some years, by their own admission, it's been 1,300. Some years, it's been 300. Some years, it's been 170. Some years, it's been 450, which is a very small amount and disproportionate in relation to the army and paramilitary and police forces that are actually stationed in Kashmir.
Thank you. Let me just conclude by saying if Secretary Pompeo wants to actually uphold his priority religious freedom, he needs to have a serious conversation with the government of India. I yield back.
Again, I'll ask the audience to be observers, please. And now the gentleman from Arizona does not, so we're now on a second round, which will allow me to give some time to witnesses that would like. But first, let me enter into the record the statement. Although it's labeled congressional testimony, it's really a statement to be added to the record from Wael Al-Zayat, Chief Executive Officer of the Emerge Foundation. Without objection, so ordered. Number of people who have been indicating that they would like more time. Mr. Batra, you were called on very little in this presentation. What do you have to say?
Thank you. First of all, one of the nicest features of India and has been religious freedoms for thousands of years before our Constitution of 1789. In fact, the oldest synagogue in the world is in Cochin. The great religions have come from the land of India. What is today India is not the original India because the subcontinent was even bigger. So it is myopic to force feed a narrative to facts that don't really support it. I think it's a fair thing to say of this Congress to the Modi government, we want, as quickly as you can, restore public safety and bring transparency and restore not just 90% communication, as Assistant Secretary Wells was saying, but 100%. So we want normalcy. We want it at the earliest possible date, and the clock is ticking. But it is wrong to say that India does not have the right to protect its borders from cross-border or domestic terror. We have that right. She has it. And it is wrong to say that we can gloss over by pandering to slices of Americana, because this will be a danger to us. We don't want to import the violence that exists there here. We're very happy as Americans.
I see different views on this panel, but none have been violent. I am confident that South Asians living in all of our districts will get along fine.
But you asked a question
I would
about property
point
rights.
out that it's time for India to let the foreign press and let U.S. diplomats and let visiting members of Congress into the Kashmir Valley.
I wholeheartedly support
because until other eyes are let in, there's a tendency to presume the worst.
I wholeheartedly support that, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Singh.
Mr. Chairman, I'm surprised that you've been saying that the foreign press has no access to Kashmir, because most of the reportage that I have read on human rights violations have appeared in New York Times, Washington Post.
It is my time, and I'll reclaim it.
I also met.
Excuse me, Ms. Singh. It is my time. I'm also the chairman of the committee, but in this case, it's my time. And I will simply point out that non-Indian citizen journalists for American publications have not been allowed in. So we get our reporting from good journalists, but not the journalists who the editors of the publications that I respect would want to send in. And likewise, U.S. diplomats have been barred. A U.S. senator has been barred. And so I would like to see more. But you are correct in correcting the record. Employees of foreign journalist organizations who happen to be citizens of India have been allowed into Kashmir.
Yeah. Can I make a few?
And make one more point, yes.
The assumption that I keep hearing in this panel is that as if Kashmir is a state. Kashmir is not a state. It's Jammu and Kashmir. And Jammu and Kashmir is a microcosm of India. It is ethnically diverse. It is Jammu, which is different than Kashmir. There is different demographics. And therefore, to say that Kashmir is not really a communal problem because most of the violence is concentrated in the Muslim-dominated area of Kashmir and not Jammu or Ladakh. Also, the problem rose in 1947 when Indian subcontinent was partitioned on the lines of two-nation theory, where Jinnah proposed that Hindus and Muslims cannot coexist. Therefore, to say that it is not a communal problem is highly erroneous. The second point I wanted to make was that a lot of panelists have been saying that there is no health care. I went to all the hospitals in Srinagar, and I spoke to not just patients.
Excuse me, that's a city in Jammu that you visited?
No, Srinagar is in Kashmir Valley.
In the Kashmir Valley, yes.
I was in Kashmir Valley. I visited all the 3 hospitals, the major hospitals of Srinagar, and I spoke not just to the healthcare practitioners, but also to the patients, their attendees as well. And the common refrain was, of course, that there is a communication blockade, but they were able to access healthcare because this was not the first time Kashmir has been under a lockdown. In 2016, Kashmir was put under a lockdown by the militants and by separatists backed by Pakistan for almost 6 months. The hospitals and other basic essential services in Kashmir are used to such contingencies, and they have worked and functioned smoothly in previous lockdowns as well. So therefore, to say that, you know, this particular lockdown was different is again wrong. The healthcare is fundamentally run by Kashmiri Muslims themselves. It is Kashmiri Muslim civilians who are doctors, who are pharmacists and healthcare practitioners in Kashmir, and they had stocked healthcare equipment and medicines for at least 3 months. So again, I would say I think the record needs to be set straight on this. The other thing that I wanted to make was Article 35A is fundamentally xenophobic and also gender discriminatory. But lots of panelists here completely rubbish the idea that 35A as a woman, a Kashmiri woman, it denied me the right to pass my inheritance to my child because I am married to a non-state subject of Jammu and Kashmir. Therefore, to say that it is not gender discriminatory is again wrong. The third point I want to make is if in last 70 years, the Jammu, the Ladakh, and Kashmir, 3 different ethnic regions, there has been no demographic change, despite the fact that Hindus of Jammu could go and change the demographic of Kashmir. That hasn't happened, and that has happened because there is a rule of law in India. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. I know that earlier you thought that one of the questioners had somehow impugned your
and that is very unfair. I wasn't given
I don't
a
know.
choice.
Yeah, well, if you wish to respond, oh.
We need to have some order in this committee.
I agree. This is, I didn't, you had passed, and I didn't know that the gentlelady from Washington.
I'm not objecting to your conduct among us members, but among the witnesses, there's been interruptions of members back and forth. This is our time. We reserve
This, exactly. And I was going on because I didn't know that there was any member of Congress who was here that wished to be yielded time. So I will wrap up what has been a long 5 minutes by simply saying if there's any way that you feel that your professional capacity has been questioned.
I really appreciate
I'll yield 30 seconds to you to respond to that, and then I will recognize the only member of Congress who is here that wants time. Go ahead.
I really appreciate, Chairman Sherman, that you're giving me the opportunity to defend myself. So, my record, my professional record, is that I have lashed out at every single government in India on various issues, from human rights violations committed in Kashmir to the lynchings over beef in the mainland India. I have a record of being non-partisan throughout in my profession of the last 20 years. So for Ms. Omar to say such accusations against me is really condemnable. Thank you.
Thank you for describing your record. Without objection, material can be submitted in the next 5 days from the following organizations that have indicated that they are sending material for the record: U.S. INPAC, U.S. Tamil Action Group, Hindu American Foundation, Americans for Kashmir, IMAGE, and Human Rights Watch. With that, I recognize the gentlelady from Washington for a liberal 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I very much appreciate you holding this whole day, and I've really appreciated being able to be here for most of it. As you know, this issue is very important to me as the first Indian American woman to be elected to the House. I'd like to start with you, Mr. Bencosme. Did I say it right? Reports show that over 4,000 people were arrested following the decision to revoke Jammu and Kashmir's special status, and one of those individuals that I spoke about in the last panel that was here, detained without charge, is Dr. Mubin Shah, the uncle of my constituent in Seattle. Amnesty International has said that the Public Safety Act, which allows for detention for up to 2 years, and this is a quote, circumvents the criminal justice system in Jammu and Kashmir to undermine accountability, transparency, and respect for human rights. Very concerned about the things that you mentioned in your testimony around human rights organizations being targeted by the Indian government. I have heard this from other places as well. Can you tell us, how does the Public Safety Act contribute to inflaming tensions between the state state authorities and local Kashmiris?
Thank you for that question. People we spoke to on the ground say that they're not afraid, that what they're afraid of is the Indian security forces, that they feel that many of their voices have been taken away from them. One person we spoke to feels that politics, as they know it, is now dead in Kashmir because their entire political leadership has either been detained or forced to sign away any affiliation with politics. You know, the fact that people who wanted to peacefully protest were then being either harassed or detained, I think only inflates the situation and makes it less likely to achieve their aims.
And how have you seen the police using the law specifically to secure the detention of suspects who have been released or are likely to be released on bail?
So a lot of these laws are vague or have don't define what national security means or a threat to the Indian state, and so they've been, abused by security forces to arbitrarily detain not just political leaders but also activists and in some cases children. There's no potential for recourses, and any of the few who have spoken up have either then found themselves harassed or their families threatened to after the fact.
Have you found in your work that even the requirement that the Indian government has people sign bondage as a condition for their release requires them to never again enter into political activities? Is that accurate?
Yes, and we've recorded in several instances of that and actually seen the sheet ourselves. And from Amnesty perspective, that's a violation of political speech and freedom of expression.
Absolutely. And tell me why the police favor the use of the Public Safety Act over criminal proceedings, especially following the revocation of the special status in Jammu and Kashmir.
So for the 42 years of its existence, the Public Safety Act has been used for things like administrative detentions and multiple violations of human rights. And so it as I was saying before, and as you mentioned the quote, it's a way of circumventing the criminal, process that's in place and proceedings in one that is a lot more easier for them to circumvent the rule of law in India.
So the Indian government claims that people are being released expeditiously and that things are returning to normal. By Amnesty International's estimates, roughly how many people remain in detention without charge?
Thousands, and those are the ones that we know
So we
about.
heard hundreds earlier. What would you say?
I remember hearing that, and
Yeah.
I thought that estimate was far too low.
Yeah.
And our documentation on the ground says otherwise. And those are just the ones that we know of, because a lot of these people have been intimidated or silenced for fear of reprisals.
So thousands of people are still being held in detention. And if you just make this brief, because I have another question here, but what do you think are the most important things that Congress should be doing around advocating for fair treatment of those detained in Jammu and Kashmir?
I mean, holding more hearings like this, raising more letters, resolutions, asking for more congressional visits. The Indian government cares about what the U.S. Congress has to say. So the more noise it can make, the more powerful a signal.
Thank you. On Tuesday of last week, over a dozen women were arrested for holding a sit-in in Srinagar against the ending of the state's special status, and media reports indicate that they were released on Thursday after posting personal bonds. The police chief in Srinagar reportedly responded that no further protests can take place, and so I direct this to Dr. Kaul. What are the implications of this crackdown on protests in Srinagar, and do you expect that peaceful protests will continue?
It is very hard, and it's, for people to register how they feel. The two key words here are consent and dissent,
Yeah.
right? The consent of the people has not been taken into account, is not being allowed to be expressed, and dissent against what has been done is not allowed either in India too. So in India, there are several activists, and this is why this is not about all Indians. There are numerous Indian activists who have been speaking up against what's happening and what India is doing in Kashmir, and they also have been targeted for saying those things, especially women activists who have tried to say that. So if anyone dissents, they are labeled as anti-national. So, the point here, and this is, I'm not making this up, this has been going on over the years, as you know as well, and as you indicated earlier. So the thing here with America, which has this, this important history, is to recognize that at this present moment, democracy and human rights are under threat globally. democracy. It is not the unique preserve of America. I must say that. All anti-colonial struggles throughout history have been carried out in the name of human rights. So we must acknowledge the capacity of people, including in Asia, to be able to know and speak for rights. And that is what they are doing. But when they are crushed like that, it is our duty as as people who realize that these projects, these political projects are feeding off each other. And that is why it's important for American foreign policy to also realize that what's happening is going to destabilize, increase violence, and radicalized violence in Kashmir is not a problem for radicalized actors, including statist actors in India. And that is going to be a disaster because there is a large minority population of Muslims in India. And the fact that people keep referring to Kashmir Valley and the Muslim majority region as being the only problem, that there is a reason why Genocide Watch put this on an alert, because the winter is coming, and throughout all of these are real concerns is all I want to say, and I want to be able to say that, as democracies.
Thank you.
The time of the gentlelady has more than
so much.
expired. The
Thank you so much.
ever patient gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
First of all, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for allowing me to step in here. I had a busy day, which would have come earlier. I guess I just want to make a statement. I understand that the situation is volatile in that area, but from my experience, I've actually served in the United States Marine Corps in Al-Anbar in the middle of an insurgency, and throughout my time and during the height of the insurgency, I don't remember there ever being a communications blackout that was either imposed by the United States government or by the Iraqi government on the Sunni tribes of Western Iraq. I don't remember any of the actions that I have read so far, I've heard so far, that we conducted, or even the Iraqi National Guard, led by mostly Shia in Sunni land, that ever had done what I'm hearing in Kashmir. So it is disturbing. No, I have a statement. This is not a question. And this is my time. So it is my role, I would say, as many of us here in Congress, for us to make sure we conduct our oversight on, of course, our government functions, as well as our friends and allies across other countries. So I think my point being is that we do have a duty to ask questions, and I think this has been a very important step in that direction. I want to thank the chairman for really helping us move in that direction. I certainly have more questions to go into the future, and I think it will benefit us and India in terms of our friendship and alliances in the future if we're open and transparent and honest with each other about what is going on. That's all. Thank you.
I want to thank the witnesses for participating. I want to thank my colleagues for participating. This is obviously an important issue, and I'm glad that our subcommittee could have hearings on it. And with that, we will adjourn the hearing. Thank you.